Well, hello again, and I'm Mark Morgan, and this is the Egyptian Magic Podcast. And as I like to say, I'm a companion of Set and a knight of Shambhala. If you want to find out more about those things, then check me out on Facebook, Companions of Set group there. There was a very lively discussion about the magic connected with that particular mystery. Anyway, today I'm going to continue with the story of Margaret Murray and rituals to do with dogs and the dog bite. I think last time I left it, well, not actually last time, because in between the ritual year, I did a recording about the hippo goddess Taweret because it was the time really. It was the time we were doing a ritual, and that people needed a briefing on that very interesting and important mystery. So that kind of comes in between. But before that, was probably about 3 weeks ago now, I started to tell you the story about the famous Egyptologist and folklorist Margaret Murray, and about her kind of reputation and some of the things that happened to her in Egypt, and primarily this incident with when she went to Nagada and she was bitten by a dog, and it sparked a whole chain of events that led to a special ritual being performed, and for her own benefit, a piece of magic being done, a piece of local magic. This kind of magic particularly interests me, partly to do with what they call archaeological memory. I was looking at memories that people actually have who live in places like Egypt of through the folk tradition of pharaonic magic, really, of magic from very, very ancient times that has this continual existence in people's memory, and often they reenact rituals from that tradition as part of just what they've always done, really, without really knowing the whole history. It's kind of historians and clever people come along and they recognise these things as part of the job of a folklorist. For me, it's not just academic interest. It's to try and reconstruct the kind of magic that people did in ancient Egypt. You have to look at all sorts of different sources. In some ways, the official sources, they don't really tell you a lot about what went on. In fact, you probably know more about the folk traditions and from unusual sources than you do about how it was to live as the official people, as the people who make the inscriptions and all the rest. But that's another story. So it's a very interesting source of magical history, but also you can recognize techniques and you can learn techniques from studying these sources, especially as they're obviously so useful that people are still practicing them, and that's something that we do. I think I left off last time. I sort of segued into the issue of a very interesting cult to me specifically is the Tsar cult, which is probably an unfamiliar word to a lot of people, but it's a kind of exorcism or ecstatic cult that exists just about today in Egypt and throughout the Middle East. And because of her personal connection, this is Margaret Murray, with magical goings on and whatever, I guess you couldn't miss it. Like today, you can. If you go to somewhere like Luxor, also or more actually in Cairo as well, you won't be able to avoid the fact that there are these kind of rituals that don't seem to fit in with any official category, but continue. And that kind of happened to her, really, staying in a village in Upper Egypt. She couldn't avoid the fact that the people were living. They were doing all sorts of kind of things that she was interested in. As she studied them, she could, with her knowledge of Egyptology, she could recognize some of the links. I think as well that her encounters with the ecstatic Tsar cult and contemporary folk magic within Egypt itself may have coloured the way she looked at the history of witchcraft in her native Britain. Really, that's seems to me what she was really getting at. She was looking for Egyptian elements, which she really loved, but within Britain, and that's probably led her into some very controversial areas, especially for people who are interested in the folklore. Anyway, we talked about quite a lot about that last time, and as I say, we left off with her accounts of the kind of Tsar cult in the village, which was a sort of mixed cult. And I think I said, I hope I don't, that even though the heartland of the Tsar cult would have been modern Sudan, which would have been known in the ancient world as Nubia, which was a place that did have a very big reputation in ancient texts as being a place where they practiced a lot of magic, and it's still, and sorcery is still the case, really. And for some historical reasons, the Sudanese people have been relocated all over the Middle East and the Near East, and they've taken with them this cult. So it's interesting how things move around. As I say, some people think about it as a demonic cult, but that's kind of just Western bias, really. Even examining the Tsar cult, you do notice that there are certain elements to it that kind of fit with modern magic, especially the fact, say for instance, I would say that there are 72 Tsar spirits. Okay, it's a number, 72, but that number 72, it occurs a lot within pharaonic magic. 2 times 36, the kind of number of decanal spirits, but also sometimes they say 72 is the number of days that it takes to mummify a corpse, and that may have a kind of cosmic element to it to do with the number of days a star will be absent from the sky in the underworld. There's a kind of parallelism between the way the stars revolve in the heavens, and they come and go, and they rise and they culminate and they set, and they're invisible for a period of time. There's always a parallel between that kind of cosmic cycle and the kind of at a microcosmic level in our bodies and amongst ordinary people, the way the cycles of the body and the way things are done. And that's a good example, really, is in the kind of cycle of mummification. Mummification as well, it's the source of some surprisingly important sort of underground mysteries, I suppose you'd say, within the pharaonic culture, overseen by this important deity Anubis, who we will kind of go into in more detail, but Anubis being variously a kind of canine figure, a dog, or sometimes said to be a jackal, although I was told that recently they kind of think that that animal is really what's called a golden wolf. It's a wolf animal, which has, again, all sorts of interesting connotations in terms of folklore. And mummification is Anubis's thing, and from the kind of it's difficult to know which direction it goes. It goes from mummification into medicine, or the medical point of view determines what happens in mummification. But the two areas are very interconnected, and lots of important things happen to do with Anubis, who we're going to go in. So we better get back to what happened to Margaret Murray when she'd been bitten by this dog, and there was a certain amount of sort of worry that she might succumb to some sort of stress disorder, really. They weren't so much worried about rabies, or you think they would be. They were more worried about what they call false rabies, a sort of psychological rabies, a magical rabies, if you like. So they wanted to practice magical medicine. She considered, when she was the ritual, as I say, the ritual and all the preparations, that it looked to her as if the physical rites that they were going to do, the physical actions that she observed and she documented, seemed to be more important than the words. So that's quite an interesting observation. The physical stuff, it's very direct, and they have all sorts of things they have to do. She said that over time, obviously she was quite worried about this at the time, but as time passed and everything, it kind of, the memory of it had kind of, the energy of it had faded, but she remembered the details of it. And when she came to write her biography in 1963, when she was almost 100 years old then. It was amazing. But these, as one does, she reflects on the things that happened in her life, and that was one of the key moments. It was an important thing. It had to be in the biography. It was a breakthrough for her, which is, it's interesting if you study some sort of modern psychology or something like Jung, that he talks about people having these incidents in their lives that are kind of breakthrough moments, really, are much more important than you realise, and the implications of them keep occurring over time, and that's a very sort of magical thing to do. As I say, the account in her biography is a bit shorter than you find within academic texts, so I had a look at those. Throughout the ritual that, as I say, was conducted, the whole village ends up observing this thing and participating in this ritual. It's basically a Coptic Christian village, but there's people from other religions there, and they all kind of join in, and it's a sort of multi-faith magical practice, or religious practice, if you like, which is again a feature of magic in the ancient world, that it is sort of interfaith, really. It's lots of different religious traditions seem to come together in a way that may surprise us in our age, where people seem to be much more demarcated into different things. I think it is the modern way, really, this sort of strict, impermeable layers and barriers between different traditions. All the way through the ritual, she's referred to as Margaret, daughter of Margaret, which again is a very common way to construct a magical spell, is to refer not just to the person by their name, but by their maternal line, by their motherly line. Perhaps that is surprising, but in magic it's very common. Maybe this is something to do with the maternal line is, in terms of magic, and is more important. And maybe it does take us back to an idea when magic was put together, that there was maternal lineages were more important then. They become less so in our part of the world, or in other parts of the world are still very, very important. So it could be a survival from the sort of matrilineal times, but whatever, it's a common thing. You have to refer to your maternal line if you're writing a spell or an oath. It tells us as well that the status of women in the further you go back in time, in some ways, up until the modern times anyway, the status of women was higher the further you go back. Maybe that's surprising. And it seems to have declined. That's the case even in a place like Egypt, where status of women, certainly up until the Romans turned up, was pretty good anyway. It was pretty high, but it certainly had declined a little bit since very old times. We're talking about thousands of years ago. You could see this for yourself if you go to a museum, and maybe if you come on one of my tours or whatever of a museum, that you can see sometimes that there's a definite point in, if things are laid out chronologically, where images of the goddess and of women suddenly seem to disappear from the timeline or become less common. So you wonder if something's going on there behind the scenes. This, I suppose, this would link noticing this thing, which is a feature of Egypt and Egyptology anyway, is dealing with the role of women, and the possibility, the evidence for a matrilineal society in very old Egypt. Being interested, because Margaret Murray was a kind of she was a suffragette, I think. If not, she was certainly well into a pioneer of the women's liberation thing. That would have been another idea she would have looked for within a British setting. That her ideas about the witch cult would be the idea that it's a war between the sexes, if you like, between the different genders, different sexes. That is being played out in the witchcraft realm, sort of thing that she might have looked for. And in fact, in her other stuff that I mentioned, that she talks about the Grail romance and the history of the Holy Grail, even as a story. She says that the character of one of the characters in it, Fledgentine, is an example. She seems to be sort of woman whose husband is the main character, is important king, but she's the kind of real power there, the real intelligence behind the whole system, the authorizing presence, and that's a very Egyptian thing as well. If you go back in time, so she must have found this fascinating to spot these different trends. As I say, her theory was that, which we can't go into too much now, but it does make a certain amount of sense, that a lot of the stories in the Grail legend were to do with Joseph of Arimathea taking some sort of the Grail itself, wherever that is, from Israel to Egypt, using local knowledge and all the rest. And a lot of the locations in the Grail romance, you can trace them to places in Cairo, in fact, and certainly within sort of Egypt itself, in that area. Although you have to know a little bit about the kind of language and about some of the history to get that right. Thus, Babylon, you might not realize, you might think that's somewhere in Iraq or whatever, but Babylon is actually the old name for the Roman fortress, which is now in the centre of Cairo, and is one of the fabulous places to go and visit if you ever have the chance. So the spell that they used to sort her out, really, from this dog bite that she had, it was going to be recited in Arabic and Coptic. Coptic being the kind of survival of the Egyptian tongue in Egypt, although written in a different script. So the two of the main languages of Egypt. It was kind of, they went at it at quite a pace apparently once they got going. And even though she was sort of familiar with this kind of stuff, she found it difficult to really sort out what the words were. She couldn't remember them, given her state of mind as well. Perhaps that's why she was more impressed by the gestures and the things that crazy things that people were doing, because it was difficult to follow the language, and it was changing from Arabic to Coptic to other things in the course of the ritual. One of the things she noticed, that they got 7 of the local boys, to link arms around her and form a kind of a magical circle around her. 7, very significant number within magic, one that we should use, or we do use a lot. If we're going to do a certain repetition of things, 7 is a very, very common number of repetitions of calls or stamps or whatever it is you do. This thing of using young children as well, is a notable feature of ancient magic. The idea being that they're less cynical in a way, and they're more open to psychic influences, and this occurs a lot in the ritual stuff, that younger people are used to find things and to do the psychic work, because as we get older we get a little bit more battened down, a little bit more disenchanted with things, if you like, age and experience maybe. Although there's an idea that we should try and recapture that open-mindedness that children have. As I say, their use as mediums, as spirit mediums, is well attested in the Middle East and occurs in lots of stories as well. There are manuals there, believe it or not, in which you can, as a guide to how to look for buried treasure, on the basis that there's going to be a lot of buried treasure, especially in a place like Egypt, and you may need special help and magical spells to help you locate this treasure, and then to deal with the kind of magical aspects of it that you might find if you're going to go tomb raiding or whatever. You're likely to trigger certain spells and whatever. You have to know what you're doing, and that's actually a subject of another recording and some writing of mine is to talk about that very interesting connection, big subject. As I say, they're working with younger people, and you think as well that people say about nursery rhymes that nursery rhymes kind of encode ancient secrets, ancient pagan lore and folklore from the past. And we don't, they're nursery rhymes. Their children tend to recite them, and as you get become an adult, you tend to put these things aside. But if you go into them deeply, especially if you look at the original form of nursery rhymes and spells and whatever, they're often full of quite interesting folklore. So basically, the 7 boys in this local boys, they take on the form of the wolf of Anubis. Really, they take on that form. They're howling. First, they circle 7 times clockwise and then 7 times anti-clockwise. Again, the sevenfold nature of the rite is extremely old magic. It's kind of embedded in the world psyche now. Everybody kind of does this, and it's there from the very first records of magic that exist in Egypt from thousands of years ago. This sevenfold idea. So the 7 dancers plus 4 adults make 12 altogether, which coincidentally is about the number of people you have in a coven. You wonder where maybe she got the idea for it. So after all this circling and counterclockwise, backwards and forwards, the boys break out and they start barking and howling over Murray, right, who's in the centre. They're kind of taking on the form, literally, of the dog here. And then at some point, when the priest, someone who's officiating, decides it's enough, the energy is enough, and he signals them to stop. But the atmosphere is completely exuberant, ecstatic rite, really. And they do a thing, in a way, they banish with laughter, as they used to say in the chaos magic circles. It's a very effective way of ending a rite and closing it and sealing the space. Is to laugh, is to allow that energy to come out. Banishing with laughter is a great technique, I think. So then, once they've done that part of the ritual, they turn to the question of the offering that they're going to make, and they make an offering, another sevenfold offering of 7 dates and 7 very small loaves of bread. As I say, the sevenfold symbolism. The priest, or one of the priests there, he bites into each one of them, kind of start it off, as it were, but he doesn't eat them. So he bites them, so somehow he's passing some energy into them. He's doing something to them. You can see that. It's quite a ritual you could do. And then he bundles them all up into a little, what they call a paquet, a bundle, which will be taken out into the desert and abandoned. So you can see they've taken the bad energy to do with the dog bite and the possible ramifications of that. They've bundled it up, they've made it into this kind of ritual offering, and they've taken it out into the desert. And hopefully nobody is going to kind of pick this up, man or beast. It said if anybody touches this or retrieves this packet, then they would themselves be possessed by the spirit of rage, which has been formed into the offering. So hopefully it would just be left there, or if any object, any animal does come along and eat it, then it's already in that headspace anyway. It's not going to make any difference, but hopefully it'll just be left. It's certainly out of your sphere of influence now. This is fairly, understandable, and we can replicate this form of magic quite easily. She says in the biography that another aspect of the ritual was that the dog that had bitten her was captured and was killed, was sacrificed, if you like, or was just killed, which was a sort of reasonable precaution, I think, if you've got dogs going around biting people, because there's quite a lot of dogs in Egypt, and probably people do get bitten, but it's remarkable how it doesn't happen that often, considering how many of them there are. They obviously feel a little bit sorry about that, so they then give the dog a burial in the Coptic cemetery, so it's treated with a certain amount of respect. And that also, I would say, was significant magically. As I say, there are a lot of feral dogs in Egypt, but people have this kind of relationship with them. Anyway, so that was pretty much the end of the ritual. She never became ill, and she was sufficiently impressed by the whole thing to set about researching whether there was more, whether there was some sort of ancient precedent to this ritual. And she found exactly the same ritual described with a few variations that had been documented by someone called Emile Gaultier. Took it from 19th century Arab and Coptic customs that he'd been told about. I don't think he'd ever seen this. And she also found a copy of it in the catalogue of Coptic manuscripts at the John Rylands Library in Manchester. So, this wasn't a fluke thing. This is there's a lot of copies of this ritual as it happens, and it has a very interesting history. As you noticed, if you go, I went and looked at this set of manuscripts in that collection of Coptic manuscripts, in the written version of it, and right next to it is a ritual against the evil eye. That if you read that and you know something about the stuff she wrote about witchcraft, you can see that she knew that ritual really well at the same time. And this ritual against the evil eye is definitely worthy of study in its own account, and I think she must have done that, being kind of quite generic really, and sounds very like the kind of witchcraft accusations that she went and researched later for this this book of hers, The Witch Cult in Western Europe. I'll give you a flavour of this, I can't resist it. In the name of God, the creator of the living, pronouncing the charm of the eye and the glance, our Master, Jesus Christ, unto whom glory, was walking by the lake of Tiberias, he and his pure disciples, when lo, an old woman came from whose mouth came forth flames. And she had tusks and claws, so it's another kind of animal type ritual. Although this time she has the claws of a lion, and her eyes are gleaming like gold, and she was really frightening and to look at. So our Master, as it says in the spell, Jesus Christ, unto whom glory be given, answered and said to the disciples, "Who's that?" And because he was not hidden from him, they obviously brought her out so that he'd see her, right? Because they wanted to know, well, what do you think about, what can you do about that? And they say, well, what should you do? And they said, this is the evil eye. When she looks upon a ship on the sea, it turns over, it sinks. And when she looks up on a horse, the rider falls off. And if she looks on a cow that's to be milked, something could go wrong. And she looks on a woman and her children, they're kind of going to get sick and they may even have died. So he answered and said to her, if these be the deeds of this accursed evil eye, take her and burn her with fire. Again, like the European witchcraft, but we're talking about the Middle East now. And scatter her to the four winds, to the east, west, north and south. And the accursed evil eye will go forth from thy servant that beareth this prayer. And then he gives a prayer that you say to kind of wind the whole thing up, which is familiar enough if you know a little bit of this sort of Western mystery tradition. He says, I am that I am, Adonai, the Lord of hosts, El Shaddai, and by the mediation of the Lady and Mistress Mary, the Virgin, and by the might of Mary Macus, the Evangelist, and all the saints and martyrs, and the fathers and prophets, and pure and holy apostles, forever and ever, amen. It will be complete and it will be finished. So there's a little bit more to that, but again, you know, that you look at these rituals, they have all the same form that you might find in Egyptian rituals of a much older time. You have a story, you have to have a little story to get you going, to tell you what had happened. And then you have some physical actions that you do, kind of like the burning or the dancing, and then there'll be a kind of a form of words to wrap it up and to sort of seal up all the different gateways. So Murray, looking at this sort of material and knowing it in quite a lot of detail, would have recognised all these patterns. He would have known, and she mentions, I think, another very interesting piece of magic or mechanics, we might say, how to do magic, which certainly would do well to be revived, and it is revived and being used in lots of ways, although it might seem a bit strange. And this comes from a thing called which it doesn't know, it's called the Metanic Stela, after the kind of person who found it. And it's a kind of little stone object. It's called a sipai, which means a little statue basically. That's now in America in the museum there, but it actually comes from the 30th dynasty of Egypt, which is about 380 before the Common Era. The reign of Nectanebo. Nectanebo family, those pharaohs, the final pharaohs of Egypt, were again big practitioners of magic, and we could kind of fill a book with the magical stuff that they practice, and they occur a lot in the talks that I've given. We can learn a lot of magic from the stuff that the Nectanebo and basically it's a protective spell against harmful creatures, which includes things like the wolf and the wild dog, but also snakes and scorpions. And it protects Horus originally from the stinging and jealous serpents sent out by Set to kind of kill them off while they're in hiding. Then she hit upon the real source. She's looking at all this material. She hit upon a much closer source from the London and Leyden magical papyrus, better known these days as the PGM or the magical papyri, which are revolutionising contemporary magic and witchcraft as we speak, and since their proper translation are in the 1980s. PDM, so it's a demotic spell, a spell written in the Egyptian language rather than the Greek language, 585 to 93. A popular spell, a spell to be said to the bite of a dog, the fury of a moon and Triphis. So it's got a strange name. To me, there's an obvious parallel, as I say, Amun and Triphis, with the name of the spell that gets by the end of its life in the Coptic era. It's called Anbar and Taribo. Same letters, Anbar being Anubis really, and Taribo being this other deity, Triphis maybe. Triphis means noble lady, not such a well-known goddess in the Egyptian pantheon, but was important, a kind of lion goddess another one, there's several in Egypt, and a consort of Min, which is kind of. There's also something to do with the constellation Virgo, because it says in other spells, I am he who came forth from the arm of Triphis in the east, which is a sort of sounds astrological, so people think there's a bit of astral magic taking place here. The spell continues using, if we take a more modern translation of this than the one that was available to Margaret Murray, it actually says, because he didn't know this, I am the strong Arab Shlamala Malet, the secret one, mighty one. The translation, strong Arab, has been made, as I said, since Murray's time, but she would have loved that, I think, the idea. So, a strong figure, a strong king, a strong local person to protect you is what you need. And the spell, as well as the words of power, this dog, this black one, the one has been bewitched by this dog. He is the one of the 4 bitch pups, the wolf, the son of Watwaret, the son of Anubis, seized by your teeth. So you call upon Anubis to actually intervene with his offspring, really. Put down your secretions, the dribble of the dogs when they're kind of crazy. Your face being that Set uses against Osiris, your face being that of Apophis uses against the sun. Talking to the spirit now, you've got this, nasty look on your face, gonna wipe that look off your face now. Horus, the son of Osiris, who Isis bore, you see, Isis, with whom you filled your mouth, I bit someone. The name of the person and the name of their mother with whom you filled your mouth, again, you bit someone. Hear this speech and stop, which stops heat, which is sent into the primeval waters and was established in the earth, and then it gives the name of power to kind of close it all down and sort this rabid dog, which is an ancestor or one of the tribe of Anubis, therefore he has control over them. It could be that, but Anubis often comes up in a lot of these kind of things anyway. And just to be careful, it gives a medical prescription as well, because you do the magic, and this is a very quintessential Egyptian thing. You should cleanse the wound and grind salt together with Nubian hematite, which is probably red ochre from Nubia, from the Aswan, and apply this to the wound. So it's a kind of antiseptic, really. There's all sorts of reasons why you might use this very ancient magical substance of red ochre in spells. It occurs a lot. But whatever you look at it, it's likely to be antiseptic and to help, as well as the magic. So as I say, Murray's approach in looking at all this material is way ahead of its time, and something we're doing a lot of now, which is to search for the techniques of Egyptian magic which we so want to understand. And it's been quite a difficult process to get to that. But to search for insights from the folk practices of the contemporary Coptic and Muslim communities. And this is becoming a big thing. It's contentious, and also some people don't want to do this. As I say, if you think academically too, if you're studying ancient magical religion and reconstructing it, it's a good idea to look at what survives in a local population. A lot of the history of Egyptology, in fact, is that people destroyed and knocked down the kind of local stuff and cleared it out when they were renovating the temples for people to visit. They cleared away stuff that looked a bit ramshackle and folksy, but without really thinking, well, actually, that's probably part of the same thing. It may not look quite as high status, but then it's too late. They've already cleared it out. You do read this in some of these records that they kind of cleared it all out, and then someone come along and say, oh well, maybe we should have studied it and documented it first. from this, we can infer the sound of the lost language is, from that's how they do it. From studying the Coptic language, they can work out how Egyptian itself might have sounded, but also you can work out the techniques, and also you can recognize in things that people are already doing in terms of magic. Somehow or other, seeing that, it's like the shock of recognition. You see it being practiced thousands of years before. You don't quite know how you got there, but it's there. We're still doing the same. Perhaps it's instinctual, or there's some sort of folk memory. These things pass on, and some of these documents continued a secret life amongst people as well, in things like the grimoires. All of this contributed towards Margaret Murray's methodology when she was looking at Europe, and we can learn from her how to reconstruct and how to renovate, the kind of find what's useful that's been lost from ancient philosophical and magical ideas. There's material there. Anyway, she did that, and I suppose she had no clue really that she did, because the first editions of her book that she put this sort of stuff in were really slated by the reviewers, but she just thought they were kind of prejudiced against her because she was a woman, and she certainly that's what she said. But since then, the controversy has continued. But regardless of the controversy about European folklore and the history of witchcraft, in terms of understanding of magic as it's practiced now for us, and as it's practiced now in Egypt, and as it was practiced by our ancestors and our successors within Egypt, we can use the same techniques that she used and find what is useful, discard what is not so useful, but probably approach it not with too many presuppositions. So many books of the past had so many prejudices, they kind of stood in the way, really. You can't really make any sense of what went on. They were so keen to kind of downplay the spiritual aspect of some of the things they were discovering. So this is part of our work, is to kind of correct that. Anyway, that's Margaret Murray and her spell to deal with dog bite, which leads us right into the heart of one of the most ancient deities, which is the cult of Anubis, and his companions, really, some of whom are quite tricky entities. Anyway, that's it for now. Next time we talk about, I think it's season of Ra, and the full moon of Ra, as well as the solstice. We'll talk about the two forms of the sun and the underworld, all sorts of very rich magic and culture that is coming up for us in our magical journey through the year. So thank you for listening, and Seneb tea.